Thank you, madam. Good evening. Welcome to the August session of the monthly seminar series organized by the Department of Sociology, University of Colombo. The topic for today's seminar is Understanding Women and Labor in the Current Crisis. Single and Tamil translation of the presentations will be shared via the chat. The speakers for today are Ms. Niyanthini Kadirgamar and Ms. Buddhima Padmasiri. I would like to invite Professor Farzana Hanifa, Professor and Head of the Department of Sociology, to chair today's session. Professor Hanifa, over to you to introduce our speakers and chair the session. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for that, Ruini. Welcome to this monthly seminar series of the Department of Sociology. We decided recently that our monthly seminar series henceforth will be on topics that are directly relevant to what is going on in the country today. So for our first of these seminars, I invited Niyanthini Kadirgamar and Buddhima Padmasiri to make presentations on an issue I think that is very crucial, but is not getting as much coverage and is not as part of as many discussions as it should be, which is the participation of women in the economy. So we are very pleased that Niyanthini first and then Buddhima agreed to participate in this first seminar. And so I will introduce them in a minute. But before that, I just want to say that the way it is organized today is that each of the presenters will make a 20-minute presentation. And after that, we will have 20 minutes for discussion. Now, I will introduce both of the presenters to start with so that we have no interruption in the flow. And then first Niyanthini, I think, and then Buddhima will present. Is that order okay for you, Niyanthini and Buddhima?
Yes, Farah. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, fine. So in that order, Niyanthini and Buddhima will present. And after that, we will have the Q&A for 20 minutes. You can use the hand-raising function on Zoom, and I will call on you. And if you want to ask questions through the chat, you can do that as well. So let me just introduce our presenters. So Niyanthini Kadirgamar is currently pursuing a PhD in comparative and international education at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, the United States. Her dissertation research is on the global and local influences on free public education policies in Sri Lanka. She taught as a visiting lecturer at the Open University of Sri Lanka. As a researcher, she has researched women, labor, and the economy and worked extensively in the northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka. She's also worked in the corporate sector. Niyanthini obtained her master's degree from McMaster University, Canada in labor studies and a BA in management, specialized in human resource management from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, Hong Kong. Our second speaker, Buddhima Padmasiri, is a PhD student attached to the Monash Gender, Peace and Security Center in Australia. Her research examines the impact of global capital on rural agrarian women, interrogating the notions of development, agricultural modernization, and the understanding of women's resistance and agency. Buddhima is also an attorney at law in Sri Lanka, and she's currently employed as a lecturer in the Department of Social Studies, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Open University of Sri Lanka. So I very warmly welcome both of you. It's really great to have you here. And now over to you, Niyanthini.
Okay. First of all, thank you to Professor Farhana Hanifa and Dr. Tarandeep Dalagama for organizing this event and for inviting me to be part of this seminar series. Also, thanks to the translators as well. So my talk is divided into two main sections. First, I will discuss the current crisis and how women are impacted. And then I will also discuss how women's labor has been shaped over the years by economic policy shifts in Sri Lanka. I think that looking at the issue historically will help us understand. Yeah, I believe there's some Zoom bombing going on. Okay, so I'm just going to continue. Sorry about the disruption. So I think that looking at the issue historically will help us understand better, right, what women have to face in the current crisis, right, and how their labor is being impacted in the economic crisis that we are facing now. So before I go into that, what is the crisis, right? How do we understand it? While preparing for this talk, I was reminded of the time when I had just finished my undergraduate degree and found my first job in the corporate sector when the global financial crisis hit in 2008. It was caused by excessive lending for housing and involving in risky financial market activities in the USA, right? And then the banking sector was badly affected globally. And one of the biggest investment banks, Lehman Brothers, declared itself bankrupt. And many banks had to be bailed out by the USA government. So at that time, the most sought after jobs were in the investment banks, right? And I remember applying quite unsuccessfully to several of them as well. And many people lost their jobs, right? Including friends who were lucky enough to get the coveted jobs in the investment banks. The company I was working for also underwent a restructuring process. The whole experience actually made me curious about the roots of the economic crisis, right, that had impacted us in that way. And I looked for material to read. Now, we were not taught about crises in business school. However, it led me to discover political economists who did not belong to, the mainstream. And to my surprise, there was already much written about the crisis. One important observation was that capitalism is prone to crisis, right? Marx and several other political economists have pointed this out. It means that from time to time, capitalism reaches a breaking point, major disruptions occur to the functioning of society, and it causes pain for people. In the last several decades, since the 1970s, there's been a more frequent crisis, and it has been produced by the kind of dominant economic thinking that is shaping our world, right? Which we refer to as neoliberal globalization. Neoliberal globalization promotes the free flow of capital. That is money that is invested in productive and speculative activities, without any regulation or control across countries. Now, Sri Lanka began borrowing to fund development initiatives from international financial markets since 2007. Right? Before that, also, it was borrowing, but from other countries or from international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, right? So close to half of Sri Lanka's foreign debt is made up of sovereign bond debt. Earlier this year, the government announced that it is unable to pay back its foreign loans, right? About $51 billion, out of which 40% is debt owed to big investment banks and financial institutions, right? Like the institutions I referred to earlier, which, went into trouble in 2007. Neoliberal globalization right, also favors free trade, which is like unfettered imports and exports of goods and services. The problem, though, is that in an unequal international market, some countries are prone to lose out. So in terms of Sri Lanka's imports, they are much higher than its exports. Government involvement, right, in the market is strongly opposed under neoliberalism. So according to their austerity policies, spending on services like health, education, electricity, and water is not encouraged, right? Indirect taxes are encouraged by taxing the products, of what we consume, instead of direct taxes, which are targeted at the rich. This is like a major shift, right, from how capitalist economies were managed earlier, right, roughly between the period of 1945 to 1970s, where Keynesian economic thinking was more popular, which promoted a bigger role for the government to invest in the economy, right, and provide a stimulus, right, particularly during times of crisis like the one that we are faced with. However, under neoliberal capitalism, priority is given to maximizing profits for individual capital over collective or public good. And that's why, scholars like David Harvey have referred to neoliberalism also as a class project, right? Because it increases the benefits of capitalist economies for the rich, while depriving the working people from being able to access basic necessities of life. So the way, the free flow of capital across borders, right, particularly capital invested in stocks and bonds in financial markets, have become the major cause for economic crisis to occur in recent times. The way these crises have been resolved so far has been to extend generous support by governments to big banks and companies in the form of bailouts, right? While at the same time cutting down government support towards ordinary people. So in a context like this, what happens is that ordinary people are forced to suffer the full consequences of the crisis, right? It can be loss of jobs, loss of housing, and access to basic needs. So we all know, what's happening in Sri Lanka right now. Sri Lankans are currently living through the pain of a severe economic crisis, right? And ordinary people are feeling it much more. Right? People are being forced to make difficult choices, right, between purchasing medicine and buying food. Thousands of people have even been admitted to hospitals due to malnutrition. Farmers, are unable to cultivate because fertilizer prices have increased almost by 1,000%. And then fishing too has been impacted due to kerosene shortages. The list is long. Right? Doctors have mentioned that there is an increase in underweight pregnant mothers and infants. There's also a shortage of triposha, which used to help ensure nutritious food for them in the past. Domestic violence, right, particularly violence against women and children, have also increased, right, due to the crisis. Now, although the crisis is felt in all corners of the island, right, it is not experienced in the same way or equally. Some sections of society are made to suffer much more than others. So like daily wage laborers, those working in the informal sector, workers in export processing zones and plantations, the urban poor, people who are already marginalized, due to their ethnicity, religion, caste, or sexual orientation, people with disabilities, right? And women are affected much more, right, than others. So how are women affected in this crisis, right? The crisis eventually is felt, right, most acutely at the household level. Women have been shouldering the burden of unpaid care work even before the crisis, are now expected to bear the brunt of the crisis, the responsibility of, somehow putting food on the table, right, amid skyrocketing prices and shortages of food items fall on women. Now, if you look at women's labor in the home sphere, right, from like fetching fuel and water, preparing food, cleaning, managing the household expenses, taking care of the elderly and children, assisting children's education, etc., right, like all the work that women do in the household, the crucial work, right, that needs to go into keeping society in motion, have for so long been unrecognized and devalued, right? So work that is often not recognized as work. So women's labor in the household is not counted when measuring the value of the national economy. For a long time, right, feminists have repeatedly called attention to the unpaid care work that is performed by women. Silvia Federici's work, for example, is, highlights this. And the campaign demanding for wages for household is one such instance, right? And more recently, feminist scholars like Titi Bhattacharya, Nancy Fraser, and others have tried to rekindle the debate around social reproduction, right? They also point to the fact that there is now a crisis in social reproduction too, meaning the inability to fully replenish ourselves, right, in order to be able to work because of the commodification of social reproduction as well. And now social reproduction requires a longer discussion. The point I want to make now is that during a crisis as deep as the one Sri Lanka is experiencing, the important ways in which women's labor contributes towards social reproduction in the household are made more visible, right? But one would hope that this visibility will lead to policies that help households weather the economic crisis better, or for inclusive economic policies. However, the dominant narrative, right, around women's labor still is that female labor force participation, right, a term that economists often use, is concerningly low in Sri Lanka, right? Now, so why are mainstream economists concerned about measuring female labor force participation, right? It's a question I think we can think about more in detail. The current crisis, on the other hand, is also seen as an opportunity to introduce flexible labor laws, which they claim, meaning some of the policymakers' economies, will enable more women to enter the labor force. The idea of encouraging women to participate in paid formal work outside the home may sound like a positive move at the outset, right? However, they fail to consider the call by feminists to recognize and value women's contribution to social reproduction, right? In addition, it is also narrowly assumed that the major reasons for women's lack of participation in the labor force is only due to cultural barriers. Such thinking also fails to give due attention to the historical and material conditions that have shaped women's labor in paid work in Sri Lanka. Right? So let's move on to look at how neoliberal economic policies have shaped women's labor. So if you look at the current crisis, it is partly due to the depletion of foreign exchange, right? We don't have enough dollars to pay for essential imports like fuel, milk powder, medicines, and so on. Sri Lanka's economy has heavily relied on earning foreign exchange in three major sectors, right? Tea, garment manufacturing, and foreign remittances via migrant workers. Right? These are the three sectors that bring the dollars into the country. And a majority of workers in all these sectors are women. Right? In other words, Sri Lanka is an economy that runs on women's labor. So how did the economy become structured in this manner? Right? So we have to kind of look back a little. in the late 1970s, Sri Lanka made a significant shift in its economic policies and moved towards neoliberal policies, and becoming the first country in South Asia to liberalize its trade. All of this was part of the structural adjustment program implemented after an agreement with the International Monetary Fund, along with the help of the World Bank. Now, just briefly, what is this IMF and the World Bank? They were created after World War II and became powerful institutions, right, in global economic governance. And this happened alongside, the rise of imperial powers, particularly the USA. Their interest is in safeguarding big businesses and financial institutions. And when countries face an economic crisis, like the one we are facing right now, the IMF steps in and recommends restructuring the economy. Countries tend to lose their autonomy to make their own policies, right? And governments also tend to use authoritarian means to push through policies that are not acceptable to people. Right? So that's where you see a lot of protests, right, around when IMF agreements are signed in various countries. So Sri Lanka was also facing an economic crisis in the early 1970s, right, when commodity prices in the global market increased. The IMF intervened and proposed those policies as solutions at that time, right? The liberalization of trade, for example. Sri Lanka has been implementing neoliberal economic policies since then. So feminist scholars like Swarna Jayavira, Patricia Lima, and others have documented women's experiences during the structural adjustment program, right? How did it impact women? So with greater priority given to external trade, export processing zones, or free trade zones, as we call them now, there was also, a lack of government investment in the agricultural sector. So like in cottage industries, in artisanal trades, right, in the rural areas, as well as in agriculture, declined. Simultaneously, large agricultural corporations were encouraged to enter and invest in the rural sector. The macroeconomic shifts that were influenced by the IMF brought on significant changes, right, to women's life and their aspirations, along with those big changes. So now women were forced to work as day wage laborers in big farms that were set up by the corporations after dispossessing women from the lands they cultivated. And I think Buddhima, will go much more into detail on that. But what I want to say here is also that paid opportunities for work in the rural sector also dwindled, right? So women were also forced to leave their families and homes and look for work elsewhere. So if you look at the data, the migration of women, right, from rural to urban areas sharply increased since the 1980s. Women also started migrating abroad, mostly as domestic labor in Middle Eastern countries. So while women became important contributors to Sri Lanka's economy, right, working conditions continued to deteriorate, right, with long work hours accompanied by low wages in the export processing zones and so on, right. Labor laws were made more favorable towards employers, right, providing very little protection or redress for the exploitation and ill treatment faced by women workers. The harsh impacts, right, of liberalization policies and IMF interventions have had on women's lives was seen in many other countries in the global south as well, right? So Sri Lanka was not a unique case in that sense. Women were pushed into sweatshops where they work for minimal pay. Such change to women's labor that occurred along with neoliberal reforms is referred to by some as the feminization of labor, right? Which means the deterioration of jobs previously done by men, as women were also entering the labor force for paid work in larger numbers. So, with all these changes, what we're seeing is that similar to women's labor, right, in social reproduction, which is, invisibilized and unrecognized, women's work in the labor force also becomes devalued. In 2017, right, I, together with another researcher, interviewed women who had worked in export processing zones. When they got older and no longer were able to meet, the levels of productivity demanded at garment factories, they went back to small livelihood efforts, right, like raising poultry or home gardening, right, which did not provide the regular incomes. So, when we talk about women's labor force participation, right, those who are concerned with increasing women's labor force participation are not really interested in how women's lives pan out, right, due to those changes. Feminists who analyze the changes brought on by structural adjustment programs in this period globally, including people like Swarna Jayavira who have written about it, conclude that those policies could only be implemented by mortgaging women's lives. So 4 decades later, right now, Sri Lanka is experiencing a much bigger economic crisis, right? Something that we've not experienced maybe since the 1930s. The IMF economists are saying is again going to be the savior, right? That can deliver us from our economic woes. If you look at the recommendations that we've seen from them so far, the solutions put forward by the IMF have not really changed much, from what they proposed in the late 1970s. So I guess the question then is also like, how would, IMF intervention in this current crisis further, right, if implemented, impact women's lives, right, this time around? Would it be in the same way that we've seen, it pan out since the 1970s? Would it again kind of pave the way for more opportunities to exploit women's labor? Right? So these are, I think, some questions that we can continue to kind of think about, discuss, and debate. I think Buddhima will probably go much more into detail about how women's labor has been impacted by these reforms as well. So I think I'll stop now and hand over. I think you're muted, Dr. Farah.
Should I go? Should I start? Okay, thank you. All right. So thank you, Professor Hanifa, Dr. Udalagama, and the Department of Sociology at the University of Colombo for organizing this event and inviting me. So I will actually be expanding on the points raised by Niyanthini using the agricultural sector in Sri Lanka and the case study of the Moragla district. You have to apologize me, my internet connection is kind of bad. And yeah, so I'm having some technical difficulties here. So I apologize in advance. I'm still, yeah, sorry. When looking at women's labor in agrarian economies, we can witness an increasing commodification of labor. This trend was initiated with structural adjustment programs in the global south, mainly in the 1980s. These neoliberal policy introductions significantly changed the rural production system and how we perceive women's labor. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank introduced initiatives such as the Structural Adjustment programs to countries facing economic difficulties with the objectives of developing economies. So if we look at women,
One of their objectives was to achieve women's empowerment through employment. Many scholars have looked at these changes and critiqued them, concentrating on the transformation these reforms brought on women's labor. Basically, how capital has changed the nature of women's work. So women engaged in several fronts in agro companies, created worldwide as part of the neoliberal economic reforms packages in the 1980s. So in the agricultural sector, they were employed in large-scale export-oriented cash crop production in plantations and as unpaid family workers in small-scale peasant units and cooperatives, and also finally as casual laborers in agro companies. So I will basically be looking at the casual laborers in agro companies, which I see happening in Sri Lanka at the moment, and which actually took place as with the introduction of the open economic policy and the liberalization of economy in the country. So this new international division of labor, which emerged in the 70s and the 80s, also included a sexual division in which men were prioritized with access to resources, skills, and technology. There is a gender segregated identification of both women's work and labor. So as noted by Geeta Sen, the gendered labor markets have two meanings. One is the sex-based division of labor, where women are underpaid compared to men. The other is occupations being segregated by gender and where there is a distinct work hierarchy between women and men. Even today, despite the crucial role undertaken by women in subsistence production, which is women producing food for their consumption at home, they are categorized mainly as dependents. Their contribution to the economy in most countries is underrepresented, unrecognized, and not valued in the national income accounting. So in light of these policy changes which took place at the global level, in my presentation today, I will discuss the changes to women's labor introduced with the new economic reforms programs in Sri Lanka following the liberalization of the economy in 1978. So using the case study of Monragala district, I will look at the commodification of women's labor in agriculture and the exploitative nature of that labor. So following the liberalization of the economy, privatization of capital became one of the main functions of our state. In Monragala district, agriculture is still the primary source of livelihood. Women farmers relate more to chenna cultivation and home gardening. In contrast, male farmers associate themselves more with paddy cultivation, which require land ownership and the distribution of seeds, water, fertilizer, etc. Men concentrate more on economic profitability and tend to depend heavily on agrochemicals, while women mainly concentrate on subsistence and agroecology, which looks at sustainable farming with the best use of natural environment and minimal impact on natural resources. So Monragala was one of the first districts subjected to foreign capital investment under the state-sponsored agrarian development program in the early 80s, where agricultural promotion zones was introduced as part of the reforms initiatives under the open economic policy. So through this initiative, the UMP government, which was in power at that time, sought to provide incentives to private investors in agricultural production, horticulture, and animal husbandry. The establishment of agrarian promotional zones led to the expansion of agro-industry and investment of private capital in the district. This led to the establishment of 3 sugar companies, including the Palwata Sugar Company, marking the introduction of foreign direct investment in the agro-industry. 30 years since, even today, we see more agrarian companies investing in the area with state patronage, targeting both the export industry and local markets. Palwata Sugar Company, the largest sugar company in the country, was set up in 1984 with the investment of Brooker Agricultural International Limited, a British-owned transnational company. Brooker was granted a 10-year tax holiday, duty-free machinery importation facilities, and an income tax exemption. Foreign investment began penetrating the agrarian economy in this area, with Brooker International, followed by Meta International's acquisition of land and financial investment for the same industry. Foreign investment in the area led to a significant transformation in the socio-economic structures of Munragala district, altering the access to resources and the status of peasant farmers. The main change was formerly independent farmers becoming wage laborers in plots of land allocated to them by the sugar company and introducing the concept of outgrow farmer to Sri Lanka. So outgrow farmer in Palwata cultivated on a land belonging to the company, and they did not own land, and they had to sell the produce back to the company at a price determined by the company. So these contributed to changes in the traditional lifestyles of the people based on the chenna and the paddy cultivations they did. This led to an increase in the politarianization. In the case of Palwata and Munragala, in this case, the process of land owning farmers becoming wage laborers. And also this change also increased the commodification of labor in the area. So under this context, the women started being employed as daily wage earners by the Palwata Sugar Company. So Sunila has actually done a lot of research on this area, like women in struggle. And she had looked at the Palwata struggle, where women engagement was very prominent. And in that, she actually looks at why women were part of this struggle and all. And in that, she notes that women who cultivated for consumption sold the surplus of their production in the local markets, and then they utilized the money earned from those from selling the produce to support their household income. So in that, in the absence of this money coming in and the financial burdens which they faced, they actually went and started joining the the sugar factory as wage laborers, despite the exploitative nature of the work and of labor. So the new commodification of labor also created new gender stratified labor hierarchies, which led to the creation of new forms of gender disparities centering the sugar industry. Even though the contribution of women were crucial to the industry, they were categorized as unskilled, unproductive, and secondary labor subjected to male supervision. This new social division actually affected the creation of a new power dynamic in the area, and like even at homes and in society. Through time, and also as a result of activism, the daily wage at Palwata Sugar Company was increased from the initial amount of 33 rupees, and it is currently 1,200 rupees. A change we can witness today is that it is not predominantly women's labor used in the Palwata factories today. There are also men working, but that too is because of the changes in the current political economy, with the limited job opportunities available in the rural economies. So the sugar industry created precarious labor conditions for women in the Munragala district. And the land dispossession which took place with the introduction of the sugar company further conditioned these precarious labor conditions which women started to get engaged in after the introduction of the open economic liberalization of the economy. So the sugar companies took over people's land and the state land, where women mainly cultivated the chenna, which was actually an essential aspect of women's livelihood, the subsistence economy, and social reproduction activities, which Niyanthini actually discussed in her presentation. So Nadini Gunawardana is another academic who has worked, who had done a lot of research regarding the Palwata sugar industry being introduced and the changes in the social economy, like the political economy, which took place afterwards. So she identified that that subsistence economy created a gender parity in society based on the traditional agricultural practices. And she identified that this changed with the introduction of the Palwata Sugar Company in the area. And it also led to the subordination of women, undermining the role and agency the women had, both within the household and in society. So with time, today we can see new multinational companies in the area, such as Dole, which is a large-scale agrarian company producing fruits, bananas here for both the foreign markets and the local market. There are also companies such as Nelna in the area. So they are basically producing mainly for the local market, and it's a local company. So we have now more agrarian companies in the area as well. So if we take companies such as Dole, that has created many issues in the area concerning land grabbing and ownership. So further, women in the area find employment in these companies due to the lack of livelihood opportunities, especially for people who do not own land. These companies employ women as agency hired employees, commonly known as manpower workers, which is currently one of the most precarious forms of employment available in the country. So this is also the increasing labor flexibility, which Niyanthini highlighted earlier in her presentation. So these precarious working, in this precarious working context, labor protection mechanisms are also lacking. And if we take Munaragala district and the companies I mentioned, there are various reports of violations of labor rights, occupational health and safety standards, and irregular social service, social security payments being committed by these companies. So yeah, so the presence of those companies are questioned by the people there and have become problematic as well. So working for a daily wage, if we take the concept, the phenomenon, it is actually very common in Munaragala at the moment. In state companies such as Palwata Sugar Company, then there's in the multinationals like Dole, and also in other local agrarian companies. So during my field work, I met a woman who had worked at Palwata Sugar Company for more than 15 years, last month when I was there, and she had only been made permanent last year. When she started her employment in 2007, she had received around 160 rupees as a daily wage. So according to her, the only change in becoming permanent is that she can now go on no pay leave, while earlier if she missed 3 working days in a week, she would lose her job. In 2021, that is last year, there had been a state policy decision to absorb workers who had worked for more than 5 years without taking leave into the permanent workforce. So that's how she had become permanent. There had been workers who had worked for more than 22 years, whom the company had not made permanent till this policy decision. In the current economic context, the Palwata worker I spoke to said that she could not survive on the salary from Palwata Sugar alone. So on Sundays, she worked as a daily wage earner outside Palwata Sugar. Also with the fuel shortage, I was there during this whole crisis. Palwata Sugar was not transporting workers to the plantation, Hence, she was not reporting to work and was only getting the basic salary, which is 19,000 rupees a month. So the non-permanent workers were reporting to work by using bus as a means of transportation as much as possible to ensure that they retain their employment. So when I was there, it was actually very hard to find like transportation for me. I had to do everything on foot. So for workers to go to Palwata taking a bus, I mean, it's not an easy task. They had to get up very early, go to the bus stand. There was only a limited number of buses in that time. So that's the situation these non-permanent workers are facing at the moment. For Dole, the transportation is provided by outsourcing the function. So the company has given other people like bring like transport workers to the company. And then I actually witnessed when I was there, the extent the drivers went to source fuel at this time. So outside the sugar company, I mean, like there's also a difference in the payments based on gender as well. So when I spoke to women last month, when I was there, they said at the moment, women are paid 1,500 rupees as daily wage, while men are paid 2,000 rupees. So there are also disparities when it comes to payment as well. This is for the same work. I mean, it's not two different types of work, it's the same work. So that's the context at the moment when it comes to like, so this is, these changes took place as results of the IMF and World Bank sponsored reforms programs. And this is the current context the workers are facing at the moment. So even though women are employed and draw a wage from agricultural production, women are still in poverty. Women note that this is because it is the outsiders who are reaping the benefits from these industries, which they are exploited and are left to deal with the repercussions of these investments, such as the environmental destruction and the chronic kidney disease of an unknown etiology in the area. So if we take Palwata, they have the highest number of CKDU patients. And now the drought, most of the environmental destruction they are facing, they blame it on the introduction of Palwata. Even the fact that elephants are coming and like the human-elephant conflict is there, like there's so many elephant attacks on like houses and then their destruction to their cultivation and all of that. So they blame most of them on the introduction of the Palwata Sugar Company. The women I have been speaking to over the years, they actually, sadly, they identify these as their legacy. Like they say, CKDU is our legacy from the introduction of these companies. So yes, with that, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, I think I can be heard now. Yes, thank you very much, Niyanthini and Buddhima, for that really interesting sort of outline of, what are the sort of the history of our economy and how it got to this stage, and also the participation of women in the economy and the way in which women have been women's labor has been precaritized through the years. I found it very interesting to listen to you all. So now I will open the session for questions. If you can please raise your hands, then I will call on you, and feel free to write in the chat box as well. In the meantime, one of the points that was made by Niyanthini with regards to the question or the discussion of economists about women's labor force participation. I think you said something like, no, but can you please explain a little bit about why the sort of say the IMF's kind of call to increase women's labor force participation, for instance, should be critiqued?
Yeah.
Sorry,
thanks.
Niyanthini, let me just finish that. I remembered the section that I
Sure.
wanted to reference. You said that it is usually talked about in terms of cultural factors, right? Something like that. Yeah, can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I guess in the way, like, we speak about women's role in the economy, right? In Sri Lanka, the main kind of discourse is that there is that the women's labor force participation, right? That there's a measurement that they make and there's a percentage that they quote and stuff like that is concerningly low, even when compared to in other countries like Sri Lanka. And the way it's explained, as to why it is low is often about is using like, saying, okay, women are not allowed to go to work. It's seen as culturally unacceptable for women to go and work outside the home. And so there are all kinds of cultural kind of interpretations that are often given. Now, I guess there's, maybe that aspect of it as well. But what doesn't really get kind of spoken about is, how the economy gets structured, right? And how like labor is structured and what are the kind of historical factors that kind of contribute to, why women are, end up in doing in certain jobs, right? Why did women, like large groups of women, end up in the export processing zone, for example, right? That is, work outside the home, which is paid and all that, and that, that's one place where women's work is visible, right? And a lot of like I think research also happened around women's labor in Sri Lanka in the export processing zones. So I think that there's a lack, right, in terms of how we understand women's labor when we don't look at what are the like the macroeconomic policies that shape women's labor, and how like global capital, right, in the case of Palvat as Buddhima described, also kind of influence how these spaces are shaped. And so I think that's one important aspect that I think we need to kind of take much more into account when we talk about women's labor. Of course, the second thing, and a lot of feminist economists, a lot of feminists have highlighted women's role in the household, in the home sphere, in care economy, in social reproduction, which is often not, as far as economists are concerned, they are not contributing to the economy, right? So they're not even calculated in these kinds of contribution to the economy kind of measures that people put forward. And so there's been this kind of long discussion about how do we think about women's role in the household, right? Can we value it? And there's a debate around it with the house wages for housework is something that we can go forward with. Other women's groups in Sri Lanka particularly have been pushing for social security, also as a way to kind of recognize women's labor, pushing for universal social security particularly, right? So there have been different ways in which people have tried to articulate how to kind of deal with the social reproduction aspect of it. The other question around the IMF usually when they put out their recommendations and the conditionalities, right, they usually provide a loan, but they demand that certain things have to be done in terms of economic policy. And a lot has to do with the government budget, its revenues and its expenditure. At the same time, they also have other conditionalities, like labor laws is one, aspect. And very often they push for what they call flexible labor laws. What we've seen in Sri Lanka's experience, what happens with the changes to labor laws is when they've been flexible, it's more flexible for the employer, right? It's easier to hire and fire. Along with the changes to labor laws, the way they've been articulating it is that flexible labor laws will allow more women to participate in the economy. Right. So on the one hand, it can also sound like, having this kind of part-time work or work from home, and other ways of allowing women more flexibility in terms of their time, so they can do work at home and also work for do paid work, may sound like something that might be helpful to women. But again, I think we have to look at what has been our experience so far, right? Whether it's in the agriculture sector or in industrialized export processing zones, the precarious forms of labor have emerged through this kind of changes to introducing flexible labor laws as well. The other aspect, and I couldn't get too much into it, right? There's a whole range of things that with the introduction of export processing zones for labor also happened. And so in addition to women moving from rural to urban areas to work, there was also like a subcontracting process that was happening. So then work gets outsourced to other small producers, and sometimes even you find women working from home. They get a sewing machine and producing for orders to these factories, right? So there's also that whole process. People have referred to it as the hidden assembly line. So there's another, while women's labor is made visible when they go into formal work, there's also an invisibilization that happens. And when that invisibilization happens, there's more room for exploitation as well. So in terms of wages, in terms of contracts, all those things are removed. And so I guess where I think the critique of, IMF's recommendation for and economies in general, when they talk about, increase in labor force participation, is that they make it sound like, that's somehow empowering women without a critique of how exploitation can happen, right? When women enter spaces where global capital profit is being extracted, right? What is that form of exploitation that happens, and how are women impacted by those things? And those conversations, I feel, have to go together. And of course, there's also a deterioration. You have to destroy something. So the question of the rural economy then gets forgotten, right? What happened to the rural economy in order to push people to migrate to other spaces? Sorry, that was a long response.
No, good that you touched on that aspect of it, of what is getting destroyed was, I think, really important. So I'm just going to check if there are any other people asking questions. Okay, so if there are no questions, please lift your, please indicate if you want to ask a question. Sinhala bhashawen ප්‍රශ්නයක් අහන්න අවශ්‍ය නම් එකට අවකාශය තියෙනවා. Okay, so until those questions come, I have one more question, probably to Buddhima. Now, you talked about manpower workers. Now, people who are employed by manpower workers, do they constitute part of the labor force as the recognizable to economists labor force? Is that sort of legitimately visible labor, Buddhima?
Hi. So in Sri Lanka, it wasn't like there was a separate category to identify them, like outsourced and insourced labor. I'm not sure how it is at the moment. Like when I last checked, like 2-3 years, like before COVID, if we put it, they recognized it as a separate category. But there has been developments. For example, with regard to commercial banks, so there are various types of manpower workers as well, agency hired employees. Commercial bank, there was a court case where the people, the ones who made the complaint actually won the case. And in that they were recognized, so the manpower workers were recognized as part of the company, as part of the workers of commercial bank. This was some time ago. So there have been developments. I haven't actually followed how the statistics are after these developments, but as far as I know, they are recognized as a separate category in the labor surveys and all. Yeah, so yeah, maybe I don't know if Niyanthini has been following that aspect. Yeah.
Niyanthini?
No, again, I think I haven't, I was looking at this in 2014, 2015, and so on. So recent, after COVID, I'm also not sure what the situation is. But I mean, we all kind of would have heard from the news, right, how free trade zone workers were affected during the COVID pandemic as well, particularly manpower workers, because they don't have, guaranteed incomes, right? Only if they are able to find work, they get paid basically. So the situation has deteriorated. One other, sorry, excuse me. Just give me a moment. One other aspect, in the whole kind of precarious labor that was developed, sorry about it. One other aspect, that was that emerged in the free trade zones is that, you find workers gathering in the public square in the free trade zones in the mornings, and then they are assigned to different factories, right? So again, depending on the needs on that day in terms of production, targets, and so on, there are these agents who will assign workers to different factories, right? So the form of even work in the free trade zones kind of started becoming more like the wage, day wage labor, the kind of day wage labor that we also see in the rural sector. So that was also one major change that happened in the free trade zones in the last few years.
Okay.
If I may add another thing, sorry, I just remembered there's also another development which took place with regard to manpower workers, that is with the protesting the manpower workers at Sri Lanka Telecom did. That was a couple of years ago, I think 2016 or 17. So from after that, a lot of manpower workers were absorbed into the permanent workforce. So those type of developments have also taken place. And even Palvatta, the casual workers, they were made permanent only last year. So that tendency too is there now to absorb them into the permanent workforce if they have completed a number of years. But still, I mean, the issues manpower workers face are there, and there are a lot of issues related to that whole concept of insourcing labor in the country without any regulations or anything like that. Just thought I'll add that. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you very much. Our time is up, so we will sum up. I just want to say I found both of your presentations extremely interesting. In these conversations that are ongoing about the IMF and how we are going to be saved by the IMF, not a lot about labor is being talked about at all. And I really appreciate the sort of the articulation of the precarity of women's labor for a long time in this country, how you clearly laid it out. And also you clearly laid out this sort of like the neoliberal economic plan and its complete disregard for the marginalization of the laboring populations in this country, right? I mean, and even now we see that we are at some kind of a point where there is a certain calm, right? Which, because of the middle class being sort of okay with the fuel quota and all of that, we have this calm. But we are not sufficiently talking about what is happening to the laboring populations in our country, and the sort of like what is happening to their, the deterioration of their, possibilities for daily life. So I think this is a really amazing conversation that we've had. And I hope the people who have been listening also had as an interesting an experience as I did. So thank you again for coming. I think Ruvini is going to be thanking you officially as well. So I will stop now. And thanks again for attending and participating as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. It was a fruitful and productive session for all of us, and I hope everyone enjoyed and gained boundless knowledge from our presenters. I would like to thank our presenters, Niyanthini, Kadirgamar, and Buddhima Padmasiri, for sharing their knowledge and valuable time with us. Also, I would like to thank Professor Hanifa for chairing the session and for all the support given to organize the seminar today. Finally, I would like to thank all the participants to join our next monthly seminar.
Thank you, Ruvini.